Hey everyone, it's Friday. For those of you who don't know, I have an obsession with all things history, mystery, conspiracy, and paranormal. I love doing deep dives on topics I often stumble upon surely by accident, and I love to tell stories. So, welcome to Sit and Spin. I'm going to spin using different styles and fibers. And while I spin, I'm going to tell you a story. This week, we're going to dive into the Philadelphia experiment. And we are going to be tail spinning these beautiful Teeswater locks into a tail spun yarn. I'm not going to do extreme tail spinning because I can't do that and talk at the same time, but I will be doing a style of tail spinning. I will use a different bag of these Teeswater locks I got to do an extreme tail spinning. If you want to see a demonstration, I posted a video yesterday of different ways to tail spin, and I am going to use one of those methods today. Oh, I just found veggie matter. I'm going to use one of those methods today while I tell you a tale. So come on with me while I spin a yarn. I have switched to my plying head today because I'm a speedy treadler and I was having problems yesterday with over twist causing my yarn to break. So today I will be working with my plying head because I will only be half focused on what I'm spinning. The other half of me will be focused on this topic. It's crazy. I thought I had a good basic knowledge of the most popular conspiracy theories. I knew that the Montauk and the Philadelphia experiment were linked despite being separated by decades. So I thought I could do a sit and spin on the two topics. Oh no, baby, I could not. The reality is I can do at least 3 sit and spins from this one set of topics. Welcome to part 1, the Philadelphia experiment, or PX as it's known amongst the conspiracy theorist groups. If you haven't heard of the Philadelphia experiment, or possibly Project Rainbow, though neither name has ever been officially confirmed, it happened in the 1940s. The Navy was experimenting with ways to make ships invisible to radar. It was wartime, and Nazi U-boats were decimating the Allied navies. A little bit of invisibility would be helpful. Apparently, they got a lot more than a little bit of invisibility. On October 28th, 1943, in the Philadelphia Naval Yard, destroyer escort 173, the USS Eldridge, fired up top secret electromagnetic generators installed on the ship. It was believed the intense magnetic field around the ship would cause refraction or bending of light and radar waves, like you see, the mirage you see created over roads on a hot summer day, that kind of ripple effect that hides what's behind it. So as these generators fired up, a greenish fog slowly enveloped the ship, hiding it from view. And then suddenly, bam, the fog disappeared and the ship with it. 650 kilometers away in the Norfolk Naval Yard, suddenly the Eldridge appeared. And it was seen for several minutes before it disappeared and reappeared back at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. The ship seemed unharmed by the bizarre events, but the crew wasn't so lucky. Most were violently sick. Some were instantly insane. Some were just missing. But worst of all, 5 of the crewmen were actually fused with the metal of the ship. I assume these men all died, but surprisingly, there isn't any information on them. The rest of the crew was taken to the Bethesda Naval Hospital and held in quarantine. Very few were ever released from that quarantine, and they were labeled mentally unfit for duty. It's believed this designation was so that if they talked, no one would believe them. They'd just be like, oh, you're crazy. It seems insane to believe that this happened, but you have to remember they were developing the atomic bomb in this area, and that seemed like insane wizardry. So why wouldn't something like this be possible? It was wartime, top secret, loose lips sink ships, etc. So how did word get out about this experiment? Well, come on with me down a rabbit hole. Strap in, this is going to be an interesting ride. The story ends up being not so much about the experiment itself, but about the people who exposed it. First of all, a huge shout out to a guy named Andrew H. He has the best site on the Philadelphia experiment. If you want to go there, it's www.de173.com. So that's www.de for Destroyer Escort 173.com. The Destroyer Escort being the Eldridge. I'll try to remember to put a link, but if not, you can just type that in and it'll take you right there. Great site. The entire tale of PX, the Philadelphia experiment, started in the 1950s with two men, Morris K. Jessup, an author, and Carl M. Allen, aka Carlos Miguel Allende, aka about a dozen other aliases. Let's start with Morris K. Jessup. Morris K. Jessup was a serious ufologist who published 4 books on the subject. Now, a ufologist is a UFO investigator, in case you didn't know what a ufologist was. So his 4 books were The Case for the UFO Annual, UFOs and the Bible, and The Expanding Case for the UFO. Now, he also taught astronomy and mathematics at Drake University and the University of Michigan. So he's a smart guy. He was never awarded his PhD, it seems, but with all of his interest in so many topics, it's likely he just never got around to doing that doctoral thesis to get his doctorate. He studied early cultures of Mexico, participated in archaeological studies of Mayan ruins, and even operated the largest refracting telescope in the southern hemisphere that's based in South Africa. So he's like a busy guy. He's got a lot of variety of interests. He's not just like, oh, UFOs are everything. He's into a bunch of stuff. But his first book, The Case for the UFO, put forth the idea that people should be putting pressure on their political representatives to research unified field theory to invent new kinds of spaceship drives. Now, unified field theory is very techie, and it attempts to merge Einstein's general theory of relativity with electromagnetism. I know, I just kind of went, but Andrew H. has a great explanation on it on his website if you're really curious about it. I'm not even going to really attempt to explain it because it's kind of beyond what my little brain can understand. But just mentioning this unified field theory caught the attention of Carl M. Allen. So he started writing to Jessup in January of 1956. Allen claimed the unified field theory could actually be proven by events he had witnessed on October 28, 1943, when he was a sailor aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth that had observed the experiments on the Eldridge. Over the course of several letters, Allen laid out the effects of the experiments on the crew, and that he, Allen, had met and trained under Albert Einstein himself. Now, perhaps Jessup wouldn't have taken Allen too seriously, but around this time, Jessup was contacted by the Office of Naval Research about a package they'd received. Inside the package was Jessup's first book, but it had been heavily annotated in the margins, at the tops of pages, anywhere there was room. There were 3 different kinds of ink and handwriting styles, and they seemed to be having a conversation through these annotations. And they seemed to display extraordinary knowledge of things scientific and cosmic. The 3 unknown commenters implied knowledge of UFOs and their propulsion systems. They used terms such as mothership, home fleet, undersea buildings, magnetic and gravity fields, dematerialization, and much more. And the Navy wanted to know if Jessup knew anything about this. So Jessup studied the book, and he began to recognize that he had received 2 letters from one of the writers. That's right, those letters from Allen. He provided copies of the letters to the Office of Naval Research, and they went looking for Carl Allen, but they never seemed to find him. Allen had signed his letters to Jessup with his sailor's ID number. They went looking into that, and it did indeed confirm he was on the ship he said he was, but that didn't help him find him in the present day. The Vero Manufacturing Company, an electronics firm engaged in classified military work for the Navy, took the time to reproduce this annotated book, and they aptly named that the Vero edition. And in this, they included copies of the letters Allen had sent Jessup. They initially only produced about 12 copies of this book to distribute amongst their scientists and naval friends, but eventually there was about 127 copies made of this annotated book. These are incredibly valuable, these original copies of the Vero edition. UFO buffs, it's like their holy grail. Jack Smith, a former Office of Naval Research official, claimed this edition was made because no one in the 50s had made up their minds about the reality of UFOs, and many at Vero were interested in the research. The notes in the Vero edition were so jumbled that they thought maybe there was good information in those annotations if they could just make sense of them. And having more people looking at it and trying to make sense of it would hopefully speed along the process. This is from the actual introduction to the Vero edition. Quote, "Because of the importance which we attach to the possibility of discovering clues to the nature of gravity, no possible item, however disreputable from the point of view of classical science, should be overlooked." End quote. So in other words, this may be crazy, but there may be something to it, and we need to look into it. At the end, various scientists and Navy officials reached the same conclusion, that the annotations made no sense at all. Or did they? There is rumor that this was merely a disinformation campaign by the Navy, and that the annotations actually contained useful information. There are stories that bad luck or strange circumstances are connected to these original Vero editions. Riley Crabb, director of Borderline Sciences Research, was loaned a copy by Bryant Reeves. Crabb felt that he and Reeves were under surveillance, so rather than take it with him on the plane as he's going back to California, he mailed himself the copy. never made it there, lost in the mail. One person's home, along with the book, was destroyed by fire. Captain Edward Ruppelt, former head of Project Bluebird, suffered a fatal heart attack shortly after reading a borrowed copy. Robert Lofton, he was a UFO author. He also died prematurely and was rumored to own the Vero edition. This is all hearsay, but it's interesting nonetheless, and it adds to the myth and the mystery surrounding the Philadelphia experiment. If you're brave, there is a link to the PDF version of the Vero edition available through a link on the Wikipedia entry for Morris K. Jessup. I'm probably going to read it, and if bad things happen, I'll blame the book, not the coronavirus. It's a PDF though, so I think it's probably safe. If you're really brave, there are supposedly original copies of the Vero edition selling online for about $500 USD. I'm not doing that. I'll read the PDF version. Thank you. But let's get back to Jessup, since this is supposed to be his story. He became super involved in the tales of the Philadelphia experiment. According to him, the experiment was to test out the effect of a strong magnetic field on a surface craft using magnetic generators. He was convinced that the Navy had uncovered a way to rearrange the molecular structure of people and materials so they could pass into another dimension, and that research could lead to controlled teleportation. Just step into another world, cross the continent, step out somewhere else. His research wasn't supporting him though. His follow-up books for the case for the UFO didn't do well, and his publisher rejected several other manuscripts. In 1958, his wife left him, and his friends described him as somewhat unstable after that. Then he was involved in a serious car accident and seemed to be slow to recover. In July, or possibly August of 1958, Jessup turned over his collection of information on the Philadelphia experiment to his friend Ivan Sanderson for safekeeping, just in case, anything happened to Jessup. Near the middle of April 1959, Jessup made arrangements to meet his friend Dr. J. Mason Valentine to present evidence and conclusions about the Philadelphia experiment, but he never made it to the meeting. That night, Jessup committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Well, that seems very odd. Was it actually suicide? Half his friends say he was despondent in the time leading up to his death. The other half say he wasn't. Granted, there were odd things about his death. He had a briefcase with him on the morning of his death, and that briefcase was never found. He drove his car out into the desert to commit suicide. It's odd. There was no autopsy performed, even though in Florida where he died, autopsies were mandatory for unattended deaths and apparent suicides. That's a lot of strangeness around one death. But wait, there's more. He was pronounced dead at the scene by a Dr. Harry Reid, who apparently lived in the neighborhood of the desert. Anyways, this Dr. Harry Reid could never be found. There were Dr. Harry Reids, but none of them were the ones who declared Jessup dead. Even Jessup's estranged wife, she didn't believe he committed suicide. She wouldn't even go to identify the body because she said it couldn't be him. He would never commit suicide. There was never even an obituary published about Jessup's death. Just one small little article in a newspaper. It's all just so strange. It's more than enough to build a conspiracy on, that's for sure. But now that we've followed Jessup to his end, let's go back to our AKA guy, Carl Allen, since he's the one the entire Philadelphia experiment information comes from. So Carl Allen was born in 1925. He quit school at the age of 9, joined the Marine Corps in 1942, and was discharged in 1943. So then he enlisted in the Merchant Marines and served on the SS Andrew Furuseth from August 16, 1943 until late January 1944. Overall, he served on 27 different ships before leaving the service in October of 1952. He had a lot of aliases over the years. Some of them were Carl Allen, Carlos Allende, the two we know of. He went as Colonel Carl M. Allen, Senor Professor, Colonel Carlos Miguel Cristoforo Allende, and Wernher von Braun. This many aliases, it's sketchy, very sketchy. But let's read his own words about the day the Eldridge disappeared. He was on the deck of the SS Andrew Furuseth. I really cannot say that. But he was on the deck of that ship observing the experiment. Quote, I actually shoved my hand up to the elbow into this unique force field as that field flowed, surging powerfully in a counterclockwise direction around the little experimental Navy ship, the DE-173. I felt the push of that force field against the solidness of my arm and hand outstretched into its humming, pushing, propelling flow. I watched the air around the ship turn slightly, ever so slightly, darker than all the other air. I saw, after a few minutes, a foggy green mist arise like a thin cloud. This must have been a mist of atomic particles. I watched as thereafter the DE-173 became rapidly invisible to human eyes. In trying to describe the sounds that the force field made as it circled the DE-173, it began as a humming sound, quickly built up to a humming, whispering sound, and then increased to a strongly sizzling buzz, rushing torrent. The field had a sheet of pure electricity around it as it flowed. Flow was strong enough to almost knock me completely off balance, and had my entire body been within the field, the flow would have most certainly knocked me flat on my own ship's deck. As it was, my entire body was not within the force field when it reached maximum strength and density. I was not knocked down, but my arm and hand only pushed backward with the field's flow. Naval ONR scientists today do not yet understand what took place that day. They say the field was reversed. Scientific history, I later came to realize, was made for the first time that day. End quote. Gotta say, he tells a great story. But there's absolutely no evidence to back it up. In fact, Allen eventually admitted that he was responsible for all the annotations in the Vero edition. Just him. He imitated 3 people in those comments. This is even sketchier. Maybe the Philadelphia experiment didn't happen. Or maybe, for Allen it did, but through a link to the Montauk Project, time changed and it didn't happen for everyone else. Brain hurting yet? How does a secret experiment in 1943 merge with the secret project in the 1980s? Enter Alfred Bielek. Al contends that he was on the Eldridge on that fateful day and that he jumped off the ship when it was traveling through time and space, and that eventually his travels landed him at the Montauk Air Force Base in the 1980s. I know this all sounds crazy and beyond belief. But the scary part is the Philadelphia experiment connects to the Montauk Project. The Montauk Project connects to MK Ultra. And we know MK Ultra is real. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. I will get into that in part 3. Not part 2. Part 2 will be the Montauk Project. So since we can go Philadelphia experiment to the Montauk Project to MK Ultra, and MK Ultra is real, does that mean the other two could be too? I mean, I don't know. My brain hurts just thinking about it. So I'm going to let you process what I've told you for now. Check out some links on the internet. Maybe visit Andrew H's webpage, get a better idea of what's going on. And then next week, wear your tinfoil hat. Stuff is about to get insane. But for now, I hope you enjoyed a good yarn. And I will see you next week for the Montauk Project. Bye!